Putin is pushing NATO's buttons. After a 2025 that saw Russia ramp up its hybrid strategy throughout Western Europe, Putin just crossed a major line. Russia has targeted a French aircraft carrier in a brazen display of contempt. But what happened next humiliated Moscow. Russia was caught out, and all eyes are on the Kremlin as it tries to squirm out of accepting responsibility for a failed attack that has gone up in smoke. On February 26th, a drone took off from a Russian ship as the vessel made its approach to a very specific target that was in the port of Malmö, Sweden. That target was France's Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, which is currently in Sweden as part of a NATO operation that we'll discuss in more detail later. Russia's drone headed toward the carrier, forcing a scramble from NATO to disable it before it arrived. According to United 24 media, the Russian ship in question was a vessel named Zhigulevsk, which is part of Russia's Baltic fleet, and had been maneuvering around the Baltic Sea in the general vicinity of the Malmö port for some time. Sweden had been keeping tabs on the Zhigulevsk and had sent one of its Tapper-class patrol vessels, the HSWMS Rapp, to observe the vessel as it made its way through Baltic waters. In other words, Sweden saw all of this coming. Putin thought that his spy ship was being smart. However, what ended up happening is that Sweden watched Russia's drone launch, leaving no doubt as to who the culprit of the attack on the Charles de Gaulle was, and it has backed Russia into a corner. Putin can't claim that Russia didn't pull off this attack, but he'll try. As for the French carrier in question, the Charles de Gaulle would make for a very good target for Russia. That's why Putin ordered Russia's failed and humiliating drone attack. Russia is likely jealous that France even has an aircraft carrier that is capable of carrying up to 40 aircraft, especially after Russia was forced to take its only aircraft carrier out of commission in 2025 following literal decades of failure that ultimately led to the carrier becoming a lame duck. Russia wanted to send a message with this attack and thought that the message had gotten through, and we'll cover what that means toward the end of the video. It's a message that has been marred by the utter failure of Russia to cover its tracks. Russia was caught red-handed from the off, and what Sweden did in response capped the humiliation off for Putin and his cronies. According to The Telegraph, the Swedish military intercepted Russia's drone long before it even made it close to the Charles de Gaulle. The drone was confronted about 6 miles offshore, not by Swedish or NATO fighter jets, but by a jamming operation that sent the drone packing. The ultimate fate of the drone is unknown. It may have been forced to turn back and head to the Zhigulevsk in disgrace, or it crashed out into the water miles away from Malmö. Either way, what we see here is an attempt by Russia to either launch an attack or conduct surveillance against a French aircraft carrier that has crashed and burned before it ever had the chance of truly getting off the ground. The BBC also reported on Russia's failed attack, noting that several key figures have highlighted Russia's drone incursion for what it is, a ridiculous provocation. Those were the words used by France's Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot, who was on board the Charles de Gaulle when the attack happened. If indeed there is a potential Russian origin for this incident, the only conclusion I would draw is that it would be a ridiculous provocation, Barrot said. Sweden's Prime Minister, Ulf Kristersson, who was also on board the French carrier, said that the entire incident was serious, though not especially unexpected, and that even without Russia being caught red-handed, everybody would have known who was behind the attack. It's a Russian way of acting that we recognize from other places, Kristersson noted. This time it's a Russian way of acting that has fallen flat on its face. Though it's clear that Russia targeting the Charles de Gaulle is supposed to be some sort of strategic signal, the fact that its drone only managed to travel for about a mile before it was jammed into oblivion tells us that Russia's latest hybrid tactic was overcooked. It also tells us that NATO is ready for what Russia has spent the last few years doing, and that Sweden, at the very least, has the sort of electronic equipment needed to stop Russia's drones in their tracks. The Charles de Gaulle remains untouched. Sweden was so successful with its interception of Russia's drone that nobody on board would have even known it had happened if Sweden hadn't publicized it. As for Russia, do you remember earlier when we told you that there was no way the Kremlin can try to weasel out of taking responsibility for what it's just done? Well, more fool us, because that's precisely what Russia is trying to do. According to a February 27th report in the Moscow Times, the Kremlin has rejected all Swedish claims that Russia launched a drone at the Charles de Gaulle. Putin's favorite mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, labeled Sweden's claims as quite an absurd statement when asked about what had happened, and he went as far as to claim that Russia has no information about the drone incident. Of course it doesn't, Dmitry. Why would Russia want to say anything more about an attempted attack that was so brazen that a Swedish patrol boat crew literally watched Russia's drone launch from a Russian ship? After all, the Kremlin has a clear motive for sending the drone, as we'll cover in a few moments. As for Sweden, though it is clearly pointing the finger at Russia, it's still going about this incident methodically. It has outlined precisely what happened, with one of the country's armed forces spokespeople noting, a ship from the Swedish Navy observed a suspicious drone during a maritime patrol in the Strait of Öresund. In connection with the observation, the armed forces took countermeasures to disrupt the suspected drone. Contact with the drone was subsequently lost. This is a blunt and to-the-point message delivered to Russia that basically tells Putin that he tried and failed with his intimidation tactics. And now that the attack on the Charles de Gaulle is done, Sweden has announced the launch of an investigation into the entire incident under its Tillträdesförordningen, which is the Swedish law that governs the access that foreign ships have to the country's waters. So Sweden is being clear about how it intends to deal with Russia. The drone was taken out and an investigation is underway that could lead to Russia's spy ship being in even more trouble. Sweden is also telling Putin that it saw all of this coming. On February 17th, just a week or so before the attack on the Charles de Gaulle, Thomas Nilsson, who is the head of Sweden's military intelligence, said the country had observed Russia as it stepped up its hybrid warfare campaign. Nilsson noted that Russia was constantly developing its capabilities and was ready to take greater risks and use them, including what I call advanced sabotage, including assassination plots, serious arson, and attacks on critical societal infrastructure. In other words, what Russia tried to do so brazenly with the Charles de Gaulle came as no surprise to Sweden's military intelligence. It saw all of this coming. That's likely why there was already a patrol boat deployed to watch the Zhigalevsk as it tried to prowl through the Baltic waters. And it's why Sweden shut down Russia's attack so quickly that it may as well have never happened. Still, Nilsson's points about Russia's ramping up of its hybrid strategy stand and deserve further exploration, so stick with us until the end, where we'll explore what Russia is doing and what it all means. But while we're on this, you are watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to hit that button. Before we get to what Russia is doing and what it all means, there's the reason behind its attempt to send a drone to the Charles de Gaulle that we mentioned earlier in the video. You may have questions about a French aircraft carrier even being in Sweden in the first place. A little logic will tell you that the presence of the carrier in Malmö port probably has something to do with NATO, and you'd be right. The Charles de Gaulle is taking part in an operation that has a direct impact on Russia. Of course, NATO isn't going on the attack or anything like that, but what it is doing is conducting the Lafayette 26 mission in and around Sweden. That entire mission, which will include exercises conducted in the Baltic Sea where the Zhigalevsk operates, has been designed by NATO as a multinational exercise where it will focus on deterring the threats presented to undersea cables. That's a clear message to Russia. Part of the hybrid campaign that Russia has launched involves sending spy ships to find the locations of these cables, which are critical for communication, and in some cases attempting to sever them. Back in December 2024, Finland even detained a Russian vessel as part of an investigation into an incident of cable severing, which is a sort of problem that makes Lafayette 26 such a vital mission. Beyond the cables, the United States Naval Institute says that Lafayette 26 has also been designed to help France and NATO boost their defense and deterrent posture against Russia, in addition to fostering collaboration between France and its NATO allies, along with strengthening Europe's borders. None of this is anything that Putin wants to see, and he especially didn't want to see the Charles de Gaulle in Sweden, as Lafayette 26 marks the first time that the carrier has journeyed to the country. What Russia is dealing with here is a display of NATO power that also targets some of the hybrid tactics and border incursions that Russia has been using to disrupt European NATO. So Russia sent a spy ship and launched a drone from it to keep an eye on what was happening. Putin thought he was being sneaky, but he was humiliated instantly. Both the ship and the drone were spotted and have been dealt with, and Russia is going to be none the wiser about what happens during Lafayette 26, outside of what NATO shows Russia as part of its power projection tactics. Russia has egg on its face after February 26th. However, that doesn't mean that what we saw on that day wasn't a dangerous sign of both things to come and of Russia's desire to maintain its hybrid warfare campaign against NATO. That brings us back to something we mentioned earlier about Russia ramping up its hybrid warfare campaign, and this latest attack is, at the very least, a sign that Russia is getting bolder with its strategies. After all, it came during the same week that the Telegraph revealed that Russia has been sending migrants to European countries via a network of underground tunnels that stretch between Poland and Belarus. Those tunnels have already been used by almost 200 migrants to cross into the European Union or EU territory, and Polish officials believe that they were constructed by Middle Eastern specialists, likely as part of Russia's attempts to destabilize European nations by using migration as a weapon. The Henry Jackson Society highlights Russia's plan in a November 2025 piece, where it says that Russia is pushing desperate migrants toward EU nations, and when those nations refuse to take the growing swell of migrants in, the Kremlin attacks those countries for being intolerant to the needs of others. The migrants themselves aren't the aggressors, they are Putin's pawns, instruments that he uses to carry out Russian aggression through tactics that are designed to harm the EU and NATO members while still remaining under the threshold of a conventional war. It's a classic Russian propaganda play. And it, along with the attack on the Charles de Gaulle, showcases how varied Russia's hybrid warfare strategy has become. According to a February 20th piece by The Record, Dutch intelligence has also highlighted just how much Russia has been escalating its hybrid warfare approach. In addition to drones and migrants, Russia is also using a heady mix of cyber attacks, disinformation, espionage, sabotage, and hidden political influence to destabilize the nations that Putin believes present the biggest threat to the Russian vision for a version of Europe that, for all intents and purposes, would look something like it did back when the Soviet Union was in its prime. A sharp rise in these sorts of activities has been seen in Europe since 2023, the record says, and it notes that Russia is internally trying to frame what it's doing as a fight against what Dutch intelligence says Russia calls a decadent West and a unique Russian Federation that is only concerned with its own survival. There you have it then. It's well known that nations that are just trying to survive start brutal multi-year wars against other countries. That's the survival instinct in action. Powerful countries attack those that they perceive as weaker just so they can keep going. Sarcasm aside, the Russian framing of what the country is doing is all nonsense. However, it's what Putin and his cronies are using to justify their attacks against NATO, the EU, and countries that were formerly part of the Soviet bloc, such as Ukraine. And the worrying thing for the West is that this all implies that Putin is being driven, or at least pretending to be driven, by an ideology rather than a simple desire for conquest. Ideologues are always difficult to dissuade due to their blind adherence to their own philosophy, which ultimately means that the already escalated hybrid warfare that Russia is conducting is only going to get worse. We'll return to that idea in a minute or two. First, let's come back to how Russia launched its drone at the Charles de Gaulle. At first glance, this seems like a unique way for Russia to launch a drone attack. After all, the Ukraine war has shown us that Russia can launch these drones from almost anywhere on its own territory, which raises the question of why it would send a ship into Baltic waters to do the job. One of the answers to that question might be that Russia's drones aren't capable of traveling to Sweden. That's certainly a possibility, though drones like Russia's Geran 2 can travel between 1,800 and 2,500 kilometers, or around 1,120 to 1,550 miles, which means they could reach Sweden if launched from the right location in Russia. A far more likely answer, though, is that Russia wanted to launch from a ship because it's a strategy that it's used before to send a message to the West. The difference this time is that Russia used a spy ship that is part of its military's navy, rather than the Shadow Fleet ships that it's used in the past. Both The Guardian and the Kyiv Independent have reported on Russia's use of Shadow Fleet ships for what its spy ships are now apparently doing. Back in September, the latter noted that Shadow Fleet oil tankers were being used as launch and control points for drones that Russia was sending into the airspace of European cities. The Guardian's report said the same thing and carried a quote from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who said, "Currently, Russians are using tankers not only to earn money for the war, but also for reconnaissance and even sabotage activities. What we saw on February 26th was different." With the Shadow Fleet, Russia already has a massive collection of ships that numbers roughly 1,468, according to the BBC and tankertrackers.com. If Russia is now bringing legitimate military naval assets into the mix, the humiliation of its February 26th attack on the Charles de Gaulle is compounded. A spy ship failed to do what Shadow Fleet tankers have been doing for months. Still, even with that failure, the fact that Russia used a warship instead of a civilian vessel in this latest attack demonstrates that things are indeed only going to get worse in the hybrid war that Russia is waging. Russia may be stepping out of the grey zone. Unsuccessfully, we might add, but still, Russia using a spy ship to target the Charles de Gaulle suggests that the country is taking a step closer to moving away from using tactics that are below the threshold of war and into tactics that lead to a much more conventional confrontation. This is all part of the Russian plan, at least according to a February 5th report by the Belfer Center. That organization predicts that the next 3 years will see Russia gradually escalate its grey zone campaign until it reaches the point where it's ready to conduct a military incursion into NATO's northeastern flank. That excursion might see Russia try to seize a border area on NATO's northeastern flank in a flash attack, with Putin's goal likely being to take advantage of the confusion that results to fortify in whatever that border region might be as NATO members try to organize their response. This is worrying for NATO and the future of Europe. A jammed drone launched at an aircraft carrier is indeed an incident that has seen Russia fail. It's humiliating for Putin, but it's also not the last of this sort of thing that we're going to see. If the Belfer Center is correct, the hybrid campaign is only going to get worse from here. Russia is going to become more direct with its threats and hybrid attacks. It's going to keep doing things like using its military assets to threaten NATO's northeastern flank. On February 26th, Sweden was a step ahead of Putin. NATO as a collective needs to make sure that it follows the lead of one of its newest members. Russia's humiliation is a sign of what's to come. NATO has to be ready for much more. In the wake of the Russian attack on the Charles de Gaulle, NATO has already heightened surveillance in the Baltic Sea and intensified maritime and coastal monitoring. These are good steps, but we would argue that they can't be temporary. NATO must meet each of Russia's hybrid escalations with escalations of its own to send back a clear message to the Kremlin as it tries to talk tough through its actions. NATO sees what Putin is doing, and it will stop everything that Russia tries in its tracks. There's also an argument to be made that the attack on the Charles de Gaulle was personal for Putin. Though it is Sweden that grabbed all of the headlines for its response on February 26th, it was only a couple of weeks before that France did something so legitimately insane for Ukraine that it had to get under Putin's skin. Find out what that was by watching our video, which explains why France is willingly turning itself into a target for Russia through its cooperation with Ukraine. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in Russia's hybrid warfare campaign against NATO. And thank you as always for watching.